Welcome to the Bracy Center for Human Reconciliation.
My name is Paul Bracy, and I'm the founder and president of the Bracy Center for Human Reconciliation. On behalf of Ryan Wilding, our Chief Operating Officer, and Joseph Ann Zidek, our Let's Talk event coordinator, I welcome you to this evening's talk with Cherie Brown, the founder of and executive director of the National Coalition Building Institute. Her talk this evening, Anti-Semitism, is everyone's concern, is both timely and important as we see what's going on in our society. And we thank you for being with us this evening, and we thank you for joining. Let me introduce Cherie by reading her resume. Cherie has decades of experience leading and training on diversity, equity, and inclusion on hundreds of campuses. She has led pioneering work of anti-Semitism, internalized anti-Semitism, and the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism for many campuses. Some examples: Brown University, Michigan State, University of North Carolina, Vassar, and organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, Hallel International, If Not Now, J Street, Jews United for Justice, National Council of Jewish, TRUAC, Union of Reform Judaism. She's got a worldly work life, I would say. Cherie has been the adjunct faculty member at the Reconstructional Rabbinical College in Wyncote, Pennsylvania, teaching courses for rabbis on anti-Semitism and the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism. She is the author of several manuals, including Leading Diverse Communities, How to Guide for Moving from Healing to Action, Working It Out, Blacks and Jews on College Campuses, Anti-Semitism, Why Is It Everyone's Concern, and The Art of Coalition Building. So we're honored to have her with us this evening, and we're honored to have you here to hear her talk. And with that, I would like to welcome Cherie and turn the evening over to her.
Thank you so much, Paul. And you almost got it. I was coaching Paul before you all came that to be an ally to Jews, you have to be able to do chaz. So it's truach. So thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And I will be talking for about an hour and 15 minutes. And then there will be about a half hour for questions and answers. And I will trust that you will take care of yourself. You hopefully get something to drink, to eat, stretch, go to the bathroom. And if you miss a few minutes, everyone who's registered will be getting a recording of my talk. So you will be able to pick up the few minutes that you missed. So I want to start my talk with, why is anti-Semitism so confusing? We're going to have 3 polls in this talk. So the first one is now. How many of you have ever been confused about whether something is or isn't anti-Semitism? You've ever been confused? So do a quick yes or no. And Randy's going to tell me what we got. You've ever been confused about when something is or isn't anti-Semitism?
Okay, we have
Okay, what do we got?
80% said yes and 20% said no.
Okay, I want to meet those 20% because I don't know anyone, including myself. I sometimes lead workshops and have people tell stories about how they've experienced anti-Semitism. And then I'll have the group vote. How many of you think this was anti-Semitism? And rarely do we have consensus. So I want to start my presentation with why anti-Semitism is so confusing. The first reason is there aren't what I would call grades of mistreatment. Grades of mistreatment. For example, if a woman is in a meeting and she says something really brilliant, no one acknowledges it. A man says the same thing and everyone says, what a great idea. Some of us would know to say, that's sexism. It may not be the most egregious form. It's not rape. It's not sexual harassment. It's not violence against women, but it's sexism. When it comes to anti-Semitism, it's like there's nothing, 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 and then we're marching Jews off to concentration camps without the daily understanding of what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. A few years ago, I was at a meeting and somebody said something that I thought was anti-Semitism. So I go up to the facilitator, a well-known progressive activist. And I said to him, you know, I think that was anti-Semitism, what just got said. His response to me was so interesting to me. His response was, oh, Cherie, don't say that. I thought about that for a long time afterwards. He didn't say, yes, it was. He didn't say, no, it wasn't. He said, oh, Cherie, don't say that. As if I was saying something so horrible that I was calling the person a Nazi. It's going to be hard to understand and work on anti-Semitism if we assume there's nothing or there's Nazis and death camps. So that's the first reason that I think anti-Semitism is sometimes so confusing. The second reason is there's a lot of denial. There's denial both amongst Jews, there's denial in our community of Jews, and there's worldwide denial. I'm going to give a few examples. I'm going to start with my family. My father married my mother in 1941. The week after he married her, without telling her, which I have to say was a little typical of my dad, he went to the courthouse and changed our family name from Brownstein to Brown. When I became an adult and was starting to do all this work on anti-Semitism, I went to my dad and said, Daddy, did you change our family name from Brownstein to Brown because you were worried about anti-Semitism? And my dad looked at me and said, no, honey, I just thought it would be easier for you children to have a shorter name. And I'm like, really? 1941? My father was the baby of 13 children. All 12 of his siblings, except my dad, were born in Romania. My grandmother, his mother, was writing to all of her relatives in Romania every week. And in a period of 1941, all the letters stopped. She never got another letter back. So I'm thinking, really? 1941, all of the letters stopped. All of the information about the death camps was starting to come out. And you just thought it would be nice for your children to have a shorter name. And I say this story, my dad was not particularly unusual. So many Jewish families, it's like they couldn't face it themselves, the depth of the anti-Semitism. My other grandmother, my mother's mother, who I was very close to growing up, her name was Frida. Her Yiddish name was Fredel. She was from Russia. When she was 12, there was a pogrom in her village. Her two brothers had refused to fight in the Tsar's army, so they didn't think there was any chance of getting the two brothers out. So they decided they needed to get my grandmother out because things were getting so bad. As a 12-year-old, they dressed her as a peasant, paid someone to take her miles from the village to the border by herself. My grandmother came to the United States as a 12-year-old following a pogrom by herself. She was an amazing woman, but my grandmother was sick my whole childhood. She had heart disease, she had cancer, she had her thyroid knocked out. I spent most of the time with my grandmother in hospitals. In fact, when grandma died, I inherited all the Jewish books I had given her as gifts. And in the books, she used to love to write to her rabbi. His name was Arthur Lelyveld. She would write all these notes to him. So when I inherited these books, I noticed all the notes were on the back of hospital menus. No one in my family ever said, Grandma has such physical health issues because of historic trauma of anti-Semitism. So the link isn't made between life difficulties and the anti-Semitism. I'll give you a different kind of example, not from my family. I just came across and was informed of something that I didn't know about. In the 30s, in Boston and New York, were huge pogroms of Catholics beating up Jews. And it was actually called a pogrom. Why don't I, Randy, I look at you, I love your face, like, really? Why don't we know about this? The Jewish leadership at the time, again, this is 1930, the Jewish leadership at the time thought if there was a lot of publicity about this in the press, it would rise and increase the amount of anti-Semitism, and there would be more Jews beaten up. So they tried to keep it out of the press, so we don't even know about it. A different version of denial. There is also a lot of wide world denial. 3 years ago, I launched a project, a coalition building approach to taking on anti-Semitism on college campuses. And I should add, if you go to our website, you can get this wonderful write-ups of the project. This story I'm about to tell was right after Charlottesville. Charlottesville, when the Nazis marched around a synagogue saying Jews will not replace us. One of my campuses in my second cohort last year is a campus an hour from Charlottesville. The Hillel Rabbi, the Jewish student organization on campus, was so distraught about what happened. She knew the rabbi at the synagogue in Charlottesville. And it just so happened that morning, she went to pick up her 6-year-old daughter at her elementary school, and her daughter was waiting for her on a picnic table in the back of the school. There was a big swastika etched in the wood of the picnic table. So between the Nazis marching around a synagogue with the rabbi she knew an hour from her house, a swastika etched on the picnic table of her daughter, she was, of course, distraught. She tried to get an ally. She goes to a colleague, clergy, Episcopal priest on her campus, told him how upset she was about what happened in Charlottesville. His answer to her was, get over it. Charlottesville was not about you. After Charlottesville, 80% of the US press did not mention anti-Semitism. They mentioned racism, and there was a lot of racism in Charlottesville. But there was also anti-Semitism, and that was not mentioned. It's as if Jews are not oppressed, so we don't need to look at it. Denial. Even When Jews try to take a stand against anti-Semitism, it is often denied. So we are all muted, but I'm going to ask you to do something for a minute because we're about to have our next and second poll. So I'm going to invite you to all look at me and say, from the comfort of your homes, Cherie Brown, you're a Jew. So I'm going to take a second and invite you all to say this. And Randy and Paul and Joanne, you get to do it too. Cherie Brown, you're a Jew.
Cherie Brown, you're a Jew.
Okay. So now is our second poll. How many of you, when you said that, felt either uncomfortable or thought you're saying a bad word? We're going to get that poll again. And we'll give it a few seconds for Randy to get the numbers.
Well, right now we are at very interesting. 48% yes, 52% no.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to that 48%. Thanks, Randy. If you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and you look up the word Jew, you're going to get two definitions. The first definition is a people. The second definition is to get a good bargain. In other words, the phrase Jew someone down, which means to get a good bargain, to be cheap. The leaders of the Jewish community went to the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary and said, "This is horribly oppressive. You need to remove that." They said no. And the reason they said no is they said, we don't make up the language. We simply put in the dictionary the words that are in such common usage. And the word Jew in a sentence like to Jew someone down, to get a good bargain, is so much in the public domain that we are leaving it in the dictionary. A few years ago, I was leading a training program, I think it was North Carolina. And at a break, a young Jewish woman in the training came up to me and said, "Cherie, I'm so glad you're here. What an incredible mentor for me you are. You're so proud of being Jewish. But I just have to ask you something." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Do you have to call yourself a Jew? Can't you say I'm Jewish?" Depending on your age, I don't know if you remember, when I was growing up, there was a brand of rye bread called Levy's Rye. And the slogan for Levy's Rye was, "You don't have to be Jewish to like Levy's Rye." Jewish is ethnic. It's cultural. Jew is where all the stereotypes land. So I proudly claim that I am a Jew. There's nothing oppressive about that term at all. So those are examples of anti-Semitism being denied in our families, in our community, and in the wider world. The next reason that I think it's so confusing, anti-Semitism is cyclical. It goes from periods that it's overt to periods that it's covert. Covert meaning the seeds are still there, ready for when the need of a scapegoat is needed. then it becomes more overt. My friends, the cycle is turning. We are in one of the periods where it's more overt, but that doesn't mean in the past years there wasn't anti-Semitism. And a friend of mine many years ago gave an image that I thought was pretty powerful. And he said, imagine that every Jew has a loose noose, kind of about a foot away from their neck. Maybe they can move their arms and legs, but they know that at any moment it can tighten. We are in a period where it is tightening. So the cyclical nature of anti-Semitism has confused people. The next, and I have two more reasons that anti-Semitism is so confusing. The next is it gets weaponized. Weaponized means it gets taken for political gain. The right weaponizes anti-Semitism, meaning they attack people and call them anti-Semites to divide progressive forces. So they attack members of the US Congress, saying you support Palestinian liberation, you are an anti-Semite. It is not anti-Semitism to support Palestinian liberation. The attempt is systematic to try and divide the Democratic Party, divide progressive forces by the claim of anti-Semitism. That's what weaponization of the issue means. I'll give you a different example from England. You may recall a few years ago, the Labour Party in England was decimated. Anti-Semitism was one of the key reasons, not the only. Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party absolutely had anti-Semitism. But the right used it. The right used it to viciously attack the Labour Party. And the Labour Party was completely broken apart because of anti-Semitism. I had numerous friends living in England that were meeting with members of the Labour Party and trying to work with them. One of the reasons I'm so passionate, and you can probably tell I'm passionate about this. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about wanting progressives to understand anti-Semitism and how it plays out in our movements. Without that, we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable to the attacks from the right about anti-Semitism if we don't take it, understand it, make sure it's not in our movements. And the last reason that I think anti-Semitism is often so confusing, we don't have to use the word Jew anymore. There are code words: globalist, elitist, and we know it's wink, wink. We're really talking about Jews, aren't we? After the Parkland High School shooting, and about a third of the young people in Parkland High School are Jewish. And those young people really went out to fight for gun control after, their friends were mowed down by guns. A number of the leaders of that high school activist movement were Jewish young people. Several weeks later, the head of the NRA was giving a talk. And he said, we know it's those elitists that are stirring up those young people to want to fight for gun control. In other words, it's the Jews for gun control. So those are a few reasons that I think why it gets so confusing for us. So I'm next going to talk about a definition. There is a common definition currently in use by the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. There are two major problems with their definition. One problem that progressive Jewish organizations, Druach and J Street and others, speak about. They give examples. In the examples they give for anti-Semitism, they include criticism of the policies of the Israeli government are a sign of anti-Semitism. Criticism of the policies of the Israeli government is not inherently anti-Semitic. But I have a bigger problem with the IHRA definition. And I should say, it has been worldwide accepted. The Biden administration has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. My bigger problem with it is this, and I'll tell you first by another story. As you can tell, I like to teach by stories. A few years ago, I was at a lecture by an anti-Semitism expert. At the time, Donald Trump was president. During the Q&A period, someone asked her, is Donald Trump anti-Semitic? And she thought about it a minute. Her response was, I don't know, because I can't see into his heart to know if he hates Jews. As if the primary force of anti-Semitism is individual feelings of hatred. That is not at all my understanding of anti-Semitism, which doesn't mean there might not be individual feelings of hatred to Jews, but not necessary at all for there to be anti-Semitism. So I'm going to give you a working definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to do it by giving you an image. I want you to imagine a line of oppressed peoples, shoulder to shoulder, united, ready to march forward and take on their oppression, united together. Right in front of them as they're moving forward is a divert sign with the word Jews and an arrow pointing to the right. And increasingly in this contemporary period, that divert sign also says Israel. And I will be doing a little segment in my talk about Israel. Anti-Semitism is a systemic mechanism. It's not about individual feelings. It is a societal, systemic mechanism that's purpose is to divide oppressed peoples, keep them disunited, keep them from facing their oppression. So it's really important that we understand this and fight against it so it can't rip our peoples apart. I want to offer, I constantly been trying to figure out in the same way with that image, what are useful, easy ways to teach about anti-Semitism, about complex things in as simple a way as I can. So I am going to offer 3 criteria for determining if something is or isn't anti-Semitism. And with each one, I will tell a story. The first criteria to determine if something is or isn't anti-Semitism are Jews or Israel being singled out for blame. Being singled out is the only problem. If a Jewish person, a Jewish organization, or Israel is being singled out as the only problem, then you have anti-Semitism. My story. I was at the UN conference on racism in Durban, South Africa in August of 2001. It was a month before September 11th. Durban was an amazing place to be. There were 10,000 anti-racism activists from all over the world. Durban was a painful place to be a Jew. There were people wearing buttons saying Hitler didn't do enough of his job. There were caricatures with men with big hooked noses, blood pouring down their face, reminiscent of the blood libels that targeted Jews in the Middle Ages. The head of the NGO, the non-governmental organization meeting, which is what I was attending, the head of the NGO was Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, and I should add, their first woman president. So Mary Robinson was the head of the NGO. At a dinner midway through the conference week, someone showed her those buttons, those caricatures. Mary Robinson said, if this is being passed around Durban, I'm a Jew. There was a daily newspaper at the conference. The next morning, the headline of the newspaper said, Mary Robinson says, I'm a Jew. Last day of the conference, 10,000 anti-racism activists in a stadium. Fidel Castro was the keynote speaker, and I should tell you, he talked for 2.5 hours. Mary Robinson gets up as the chair of the NGO conference. Mary Robinson was hissed and booed by at least half of that stadium. I was devastated. These are my people. These are anti-racism activists. And half of that stadium is hissing and booing her. And it could only be for one reason. That she said, if these anti-Semitic things are being passed around Durban, I'm a Jew. I can still cry about it. I came home and said, Cherie, this has to be your work. You have got to figure out how to turn around the anti-Semitism and progressive movements and get people understanding what is going on. So that's the first criteria, singled out for blame. The second criteria is a liberation movement being divided by claims of anti-Semitism. And I specifically say claims because part of the issue is people get into big debates. Again, is it, isn't it? For all the reasons I said earlier. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Creating Change, a major gay liberation conference. And I'm not sure if it happens annually or every other year. A few years ago, Creating Change invited to be on a panel a group from Israel called A Greater Bridge, gay liberation activists living in Israel. They invited them to the conference to speak on a panel. A bunch of activists went to the organizers and said, Israel is the worst perpetrator of oppression in the entire world. You cannot invite anybody, even progressive gay activists from Israel, to speak at the conference. They uninvited A Greater Bridge. They didn't want to be colluding with horrible oppression. Progressive Jews went to the organizers and said, you have to reinvite them. We should be welcoming with open arms progressives from Israel that want to align with us to fight fascist forces in the US and in Israel. Why wouldn't we welcome them? They reinvited A Greater Bridge. Apparently there were big fistfights. The police was called. The entire conference broke apart. Weeks later, the president of that organization was given my name, and I've spent hours with her, helping her understand what is anti-Semitism and what they could do in the future. So that was ripping apart a gay liberation organization. And my other example is the Women's March. Right after Donald Trump was elected, in January of 2017 was one of the most powerful moments of my life. I have read that it was the largest demonstration on the mall ever. You literally couldn't, we were shouldered, you could not move or breathe. There were so many women and allies on the mall, taking on sexism, uniting issues of racism and sexism. It was such a powerful movement that the right decided it needed to rip it apart. Two of the coordinators of the Women's March were strong advocates for Palestinian liberation. The right attacked the Women's March and said it was horribly anti-Semitic. Some people thought what some of the organizers were saying was anti-Semitic, and some did not. In my mind, that's not the key point. The key point was the right went after the Women's March viciously. And every city were having discussions. Do we have to drop out of the march? Should we stay in the march? Oh my God, I don't want to be in something that's anti-Semitic. City after city after city pulled out of the Women's March as an organization, set up their own little women's marches. The Women's March never had the power again that it had. So again, a key component of anti-Semitism is it being used to divide progressive movements. And my third criteria. So the first, singled out for blame, used to divide progressive movements. The third criteria of whether something is or isn't anti-Semitism, is there a litmus test that Jews have to go through that nobody else does? Are Jews isolated and singled out with a litmus test to be at the table that nobody else has to go through? An example, a few years ago, a speaker was addressing about a 2,000 person audience at a university. My guess is she was really trying to communicate, we need everybody to build this strong movement we're trying to build. She says, we need everybody. We need Black African heritage folks. We need Latinx folks. We need Asian heritage and Native Indigenous peoples and LGBTQ and women and progressive Jews. No other group had a defining litmus test about whether they could be at the table. And as we know, there are folks in all those groups that are not progressive. But no other group had to sign a statement at the door to even get in and sit at the table. So that is the third criteria. Is there a litmus test? Are Jews isolated out with requirements to even be at the table that no other group is required? There is no question that anti-Semitism is on the rise in this period. But I think it's really important that we also understand it's not on the rise in isolation. Massive rise of sexism, attack on women and women's bodies, massive rise in racism. We aren't going to teach history. We aren't going to be able to even teach the history of racism in our schools. Massive attacks on gay folks, trans peoples. Don't say gay. Legislation to not allow young people to define how they define their gender identity. So anti-Semitism is not on the rise in isolation. I think that's really important. And this is a talk on what anti-Semitism in the current period looks like. So I'm going to now share 7 examples of very recent anti-Semitism, 5 in my neighborhood. And I'm intentionally doing that because I want to say it's close to us. It's close to home. It's not far away. The reason I am doing this is not to be alarmist. This is a good moment for a Jewish on the one hand and on the other hand, a very Jewish way of studying Jewish text. On the one hand, I don't want to alarm you or terrify you. On the other hand, if we don't know what's going on, we can't fight it. So if you are in a place not alone, I want you to cuddle up, get close to someone, or I will reach my hands across to you, that we stay connected as you listen to these next stories. And we are now going to have the third and last poll before I tell the stories. And this question is, how many of you have either been targeted by anti-Semitism or been witness to anti-Semitism? Been the target of it or witness to it? And again, I'll give a few seconds for Randy to collect the numbers. What do we got?
89% say yes. 11% say no.
Okay. So my comment is to the 89% and to the 11%. I believe we are in a beginning period of consciousness raising about anti-Semitism. You know, I was active in the women's movement in the early 70s, and I would think, oh, I've never experienced sexism. And then I'd go to a women's consciousness raising group and I'd listen to woman after woman tell her story. And I'd go, oh, that happened to me. Oh yeah, that happened to me too. I believe we are at the same point that the women's movement was in the early 70s, of consciousness raising, of just beginning to tell each other our stories so we understand what anti-Semitism even looks like. So, or you've got my arms across the screen. Again, 5 stories from my neighborhood and 2 from other parts of the United States. The first example, 6 years ago, I launched a project of an organization I've been in for about 50 years called Re-Evaluation Counseling, that trains people to do healing work with each other. And I launched a project of the organization, Jews and Allies United to End Anti-Semitism. At the end, when Randy gives resources, he's going to give you a website. It's jewsandallies.org. So there's a local project of my team in the DC area. And we decided to do what's called a listening project, which is create a space for people to get listened to. And we were at the Tacoma Park Street Festival. If you're not familiar with Tacoma Park, we sometimes call it the Berkeley of Maryland. It's counterculture, a lot of activists. It's a good place to try to do work on anti-Semitism. So there were hundreds of tables, you know, along roads and rows of tables, political information, people selling food, etc. So we had a table for our Jews and Allies United to End Anti-Semitism project, and we had a big sign up on top of the table saying, have you experienced anti-Semitism recently? Many people came by. The one I'm going to share, a high school student came by the table and she said, I'm so glad you're here. My high school, and her high school is 10 minutes north of where I live. She said, my high school has a hate Jews club in the high school. And she burst into tears. And I just listened to her cry for a bit. And then I said, hon, what are your teachers and guidance counselors say about this? They tell her it is a free speech First Amendment right to have a hate Jews club in the school, so they are not disbanding it. Literally weeks after that, a buddy of mine who's a drama teacher at a high school even closer, 3 blocks from me, she called me up and she said, there's swastikas showing up at all the high schools here in Montgomery County. The county I live, Montgomery County, is the most diverse county in the United States. Swastikas were showing up at high schools, and she asked if I could come and do a teach-in at her high school. The next one, about 20 minutes from where I live, is a town in Maryland, Gaithersburg. There was a giant supermarket. There was a group of young people in the supermarket causing some mischief. I think they were throwing food, stealing donuts. And a customer decided he wanted to see if he could do something. So he walks over to the young people. He happened to be wearing a big Jewish star. The head of the group of young people starts pummeling him and hitting him. And with every fist, the young person says, this one's for Kanye, and this one's for Kanye. He was knocked unconscious. He did live. I'm sure many of you know Kanye West said some pretty anti-Semitic things a little while back. 2 more examples from my neighborhood. All of you are familiar with January 6th. The day before January 6th, January 5th, Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., got word that there was likely to be major trouble the next day. You know, I don't believe it when people say we knew nothing. So Muriel Bowser gets a message that there's likely to be a crowd control trouble and a lot of people coming to cause trouble at the Capitol. So she sends a note to every hotel in Washington, D.C. to please limit the number of hotel rooms they have the night of January 5th to see if in some way she could help curtail things. So a whole group of Proud Boys couldn't get a hotel room. I live right next to DC. I live in Silver Spring, and there's about 4 hotels at the corner of my street. I can walk to them. We have a very active listserv in my neighborhood. That afternoon, report after report from the listserv was saying, Proud Boys are in the supermarket with swastikas on their arms. Proud Boys are marching around. We have a little Orthodox shul 5 minutes from me, and Proud Boys were marching around the Orthodox synagogue. My last example from my neighborhood. A good buddy of mine is the executive director of a synagogue about 5 minutes from where I live. She, along with every synagogue in the United States, has training and active shooter training. She told me one day the DC police was training her and the rabbi, and they were at a window of a classroom for Jewish children, and they were discussing if a gun goes through the window with a shot, where should the children be seated so they're less likely to be harmed? These conversations are happening at synagogues all over the country. At Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in my congregation, my rabbi starts every service. Well, first we have armed guards out front, and he starts every service with information, if there is trouble, what to do and where to go. My friend said she goes out in the parking lot every day, and she looks at every license plate on every car. If there is a car that she does not recognize the license plate, she takes a picture of it and she sends it to the DC police. The rabbi of her congregation has a panic button to push in case there's trouble. Apparently, a few weeks ago, he pushed it by mistake. Within minutes, 10 DC police showed up with rifles, weapons pointed, ready to shoot. And again, I want to repeat, I am not sharing these stories to alarm you. However, if we're going to take on anti-Semitism, we need to know. And because of the issue of denial that I mentioned earlier, and it being denied so much, most of these stories are not known. And I have two more that are not in my neighborhood. This next one, there was a state university. A chemistry professor gave an exam. A question on the chemistry exam was, during the period of the Nazi Holocaust, the Nazis used gas to kill Jews in gas chambers. If it takes this much gas to kill one person, and here's the dimensions of a gas chamber, how much gas would it take to kill everyone in the gas chamber? Friends, I can't make these stories up. A Jewish student was taking that exam, understandably incredibly upset. He takes the exam to the administrators. They go talk to the professor. If it stops there, you could say, all right, a very unaware at best, totally anti-Semitic at worst professor. It didn't stop there. The student newspaper did an entire satire of the incident, of the Jewish students' response. It was all done in an entire newspaper satire for the entire campus. Ha ha, wasn't this funny? We should be able to laugh at this. Don't take it so seriously. Jews and their allies were upset even more. They go to the administration and they say, this is a sign that we need a teach-in on anti-Semitism on our campus. The administration said no. The reason they said no, they said this was a small example in one little place. It is not relevant for the whole campus. So we are not going to have a teach-in on anti-Semitism. I next want to look for a few minutes about anti-Semitism and Christianity. I think it's important to say Christianity is not the underlying cause of anti-Semitism. It is not. I have friends who think it is, and I do not agree with them. I think that's not a useful or accurate statement. However, Christianity has been used for hundreds of years as a vehicle to spread anti-Semitism. And I'm going to offer 3 examples in the current period with 3 different denominations: Evangelical, Southern Baptist, and Catholic. So Evangelical first. There is a theory, Evangelical theology believes that before the Messiah can come again, they use the term remnants, that there's a small group of Jews who will have to convert to Christianity and take Jesus as their Lord before the Messiah will come again. That is evangelical theology. A few years ago, my husband had pneumonia and was in the hospital. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. I was, of course, very anxious. He was quite ill. He did get fined. He was quite ill, and I was trying to take my attention off of worrying about him. So 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, I turned on the radio. And as I'm sure you know, at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, you're going to get a lot of preaching. So the radio station I happened to turn to, the preacher was saying, you better be good to your Jewish doctors and lawyers. And I kid you not, it was doctors and lawyers, because we don't know which of them could end up being one of the remnants, one of those small numbers of Jews that will convert to Christianity. And the Messiah can come again. So you better be nice to those Jews. So that's evangelical anti-Semitism. Southern Baptist, one of the largest denominations in the United States. Several years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution. We will no longer dialogue with Jews. Their national convention. We will no longer dialogue with Jews. We are going to switch to evangelizing and trying to convert Jews to Christianity. In fact, the Catholic Church pulled out of dialogues with Southern Baptists in protest for that resolution. And that resolution still stands. In the Southern Baptist Convention, we will not dialogue with Jews. We will only evangelize and try to convert Jews. And the last, the Catholic Church. My husband is a former Roman Catholic priest. He had been a priest for 10 years when we met. He ran the Office of Ecumenical Affairs in Louisville, Kentucky. He did all of this Catholic Jewish dialogue work. In fact, he made sure that every Catholic textbook was reviewed by rabbis to make sure that there was nothing anti-Semitic in them. That has never been done anywhere else. He left the church and we got married, and he wants me to make sure that the Catholics know that he was laicized, which means he was granted permission by the Pope to give up his vows of celibacy. Many priests do not get laicized, but George worked for an entire year with a canon lawyer, got laicized. So he is completely in good standing with the church. He retired. So after he left he left the active ministry, because according to the Catholic Church, you are always still a priest. But he left the active ministry and he became a civil rights lawyer. He was a civil rights lawyer at the Justice Department for 26 years. He just retired a few years ago. He has returned to the work of his heart. He is finishing a dissertation. He believes that the Catholic Church has plateaued on its work on anti-Semitism. And what he's doing in his dissertation, Pew Research had collected thousands of sermons in different denominations. They gave him permission to have those that were from Catholic priests. He looked at sermons in 2019, specifically on 3 days of the year when the gospel readings have the most anti-Semitic words in them. Good Friday, Palm Sunday, and the week after Easter, which was just this past Sunday. This past Sunday, if you were in a Catholic, Lutheran, or Episcopal church in particular, and you heard the gospel reading said, the disciples of Jesus locked the doors because they were so scared of the Jews. That's the gospel reading that was told in churches all over the world this past Sunday. So what George has done, He reviewed 200 sermons by priests done in 2019 to see, did they say anything? Did they try to help people make sense and understanding of that phrase? For example, all the disciples were Jews. Jesus was a Jewish renewal movement. Of the 200 sermons that he reviewed, not one priest said one word in any way to help people make sense of it, understand it in historic context, to undo the attitudes of anti-Semitism that were likely to be there when you hear the disciples of Jesus locked the doors in fear of the Jews. So I want to end this piece around Christianity by saying, again, I believe deeply that we can have Christianity without anti-Semitism. I believe deeply that we can have Christianity without anti-Semitism. We're just not there yet. We have some work to do. So I have 2 more sections to my talk. You may want to take a stretch or a wiggle, get some water. The next segment I want to talk about, for me, is sometimes the elephant in the room about anti-Semitism. The elephant in the room about anti-Semitism, and that elephant is Israel. We Jews pride ourselves on being able to dialogue, ask questions, disagree. We joke amongst ourselves, 5 Jews, 10 opinions. A very dear friend of mine, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, has used the term God wrestling. When Jacob in the Bible wrestled with the angel, his name was turned to Israel. Jacob's name was turned to Israel in the Bible when he wrestles with the angel. That is such a deep part of who we are as a people, to challenge, to question, to wrestle with things. For many, many, many years, it's starting to turn. But for many, many, many years, instead of 5 Jews, 10 opinions on Israel, 10 Jews, only 1 opinion allowed. Why is that? Israel became so linked to the fears for Jewish survival that it was so terrifying for anyone to say anything that could even appear. In the late 70s, there was a Jewish peace organization called Bracy. I was at their founding meeting. Rabbis on college campuses who supported Bracy were fired. All of them. That was in the late 70s. We've moved from there, but it remains a very painful issue. I was an adjunct faculty for many years at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which is just outside Philadelphia. I taught conflict resolution for rabbis, Israel-Palestine for rabbis. Many of my rabbinic students told me, as interns in synagogues, they were told, do not mention Israel in your sermons. Do not even mention it. It will stir up so much conflict. In 2014, a new Jewish peace organization in the US founded If Not Now. 2014 was when there was the war between Israel and Gaza, called the Gaza War. Jewish young activists were upset that many of the progressive Jewish organizations did not take a principled stand against the Gaza war. So they said, we need a new organization. And they decided to be an organization for just young adult Jews. And I have been a supporter. I've led trainings for them. I've been a consultant to them. So this last year, we decided to do a 3-part series where young adult activists, and If Not Now, could invite a Jewish elder for a meeting on intergenerational issues around Israel and Palestine, because there's huge intergenerational issues that we need to understand to move forward on this issue. One of the skills we taught in the training is how to listen to the heartfelt concerns under a very divisive issue that people don't agree on. It's a skill practice we teach in my organization. The question the group chose to learn how to listen to the heartfelt concerns of each other when there's disagreement was, does Israel make the world a safer place for Jews? Does Israel make the world a safer place for Jews? All of the elders, 50, 60, 70, and on, said yes. Israel makes the world a safer place for Jews. All of the younger people under 40 said no. I was born in 1949, 1 year after the foundation of the State of Israel, 3 years after the end of the Holocaust. For so many Jews, for my parents, my grandparents, Israel was the hope that after 2,000 years of hatred, after the pogroms they lived through, after the Holocaust that killed their families, there would be a place to go. My young adult Jewish friends were all born after 1967. 1967 was called the Yom Kippur War, when Gaza and West Bank were occupied and have maintained being occupied by Israel. So my young Jewish friends know nothing of Israel as a refuge post-Holocaust. For them, Israel is only one thing, an occupier force. And I get it. If we're going to move forward on understanding the anti-Semitism in Israel, this intergenerational piece is key. So I'm going to offer a few directions on how to think about Israel, particularly in relation to the issue of anti-Semitism. The first is there are two narratives. There is a Jewish narrative and there is a Palestinian narrative. We need to understand both deeply, and most people do not. I will again say it is not anti-Semitism to be critical of the policies of the Israeli government. So I want to share, there's so much one could say about Israel and the issue of anti-Semitism. And the few points I want to make, I think, are helpful to clear up confusion and make sense of a very complex issue. So the first point, most people do not know that there were major attempts in Palestine in the early 1900s up until close to 1948. There were many attempts at cooperation between Arabs and Jews living in Palestine, particularly amongst trade union activists. Britain at the time was controlling and in charge of Palestine. And if you know anything about British history, divide and conquer is the major mechanism they used to build their empire and to control the peoples they ruled over. Literally, there were events where the British would drop a leaflet into predominant Arab neighborhoods and drop a different, completely opposite leaflet into predominantly Jewish neighborhoods, literally systematically pitting Arabs and Jews, because that's how they maintained control. They kept the peoples amongst whom they controlled fighting each other. I don't tend to give people lots of names of books. There's a powerful book. I recently think it's out of print, but hopefully on eBay, you can find it. It is called There Could Have Been Peace by Aharon Cohen, a very powerful book. He was a member of a party in Israel called Mapam. He documents every incident of cooperation between Arabs and Jews that was ripped apart by the British. So that's the first point. Most people do not know that history. The second point, there were huge disagreements. Talk about debate and dialogue amongst my people. There were huge disagreements amongst Jewish leaders, certainly in the United States, about whether the idea of returning to ancestral homeland, to have a homeland in Israel, made any sense at all. Many prominent rabbis in the US did not think that made any sense at all. There was a defining moment when that all changed. 1941, the same year my father changed our family name from Brownstein to Brown. 2 years before this, it was called the Biltmore Declaration at a convention. 2 years before, the St. Louis was the ship with 937 Jewish refugees that left Europe to try to save their lives. They landed in Cuba. The Cuban government said initially they would take them, and then they refused. They didn't allow them to come ashore. That boat went to Florida. The US government refused to take them. The Canadian government refused to take them. The St. Louis had to turn around and go back to Europe, and many of those Jews were killed in the camps. So that was only 2 years before 1941. All the information of the death camps. It became a moot point for the Jewish leadership. Like, do we think it's a good idea to have a homeland for Jews? In a total desperate moment, the agreement was made that we want to try to seek a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state, which eventually became the foundation of Israel in 1948. I also want to add, at the end of the war, Eisenhower was president. The Eisenhower doctrine initially was return every refugee to their homeland of origin. You're going to have Jews go back to Poland that had killed 2 million? You're going to have Jews go back to Germany? And I just recently learned that the Jews that did, the very few that did go back to try to reclaim their homes, there were active pogroms after the end of the war in those villages where Jews in any way tried to go back and reclaim their homes and their lives. So I say all this, that the foundation of the state of Israel came off the shoulders of the most devastating moment in Jewish history. So for Jews, 1948 was a moment of great celebration. 1948 is also the Nakba. The Nakba is Arabic, and it means catastrophe. To settle Israel, Jews kicked off and displaced thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians. This history is not taught to Jews for the most part. Only recently are there books and stories and information starting to come out, truth telling about the displacement of the Palestinian people. So there, my friends, we have, coming off the Holocaust, a third of the Jewish people have been annihilated by genocide, desperately wanting a home. We have the Palestinian people who also lived in that land, where all the early cooperation efforts didn't succeed, being displaced, the Nakba, the catastrophe, and both narratives are true. One of the challenges in the work, and this is so key for the work on anti-Semitism, because the issue of Israel is such a dominant place in progressive movements, that the anti-Semitism plays out, as I shared in some of my earlier stories. Holding both peoples is so important. And in my experience, for most people, and I will include myself, if you're listening to me and you say, oh, I do that, I'm not talking about intellectually. In the deepest places of our hearts where oppression lives, to deeply hold both peoples. It is what we need to do, and it is not easy. Last year, I was on a phone call with a Palestinian friend of mine, and it was the week that two Palestinian prisoners that were in Israeli prisons escaped. And at the moment I was talking to my friend, they had not been, I'm not sure what the word is, found. My Palestinian sister said to me, it was the highlight of her week that these two Palestinian prisoners, who were in prison because they killed numbers of Jews, her highlight of her week was that they'd escaped. And I listened to her and I said, tell me more. I want to understand how you see this. And I remember feeling terror inside my heart and realizing we love each other. We are Palestinian Jewish sisters. But in these moments, what hurts one of us is very different than what hurts the other. And I will share with you one last important story for me on this issue of Israel. A bunch of years ago, I was leading a program with an Arab man. We were trying to model an Arab and a Jew being for each other's peoples. At one point in my presentation, I said something like, you know, I care about the Israeli people. I didn't finish my presentation. There was a woman, there were about 500 people in the presentation. There was a woman from the back of the room, and she stood up and she started screaming at me. How dare you say you care about the Israeli people? She screamed and screamed at me. Some of the things she said to me and screamed at me, I agreed with. The horrible oppression under occupation. Some of the things she said I didn't agree with. But everything inside of me said, Cherie, you have to listen to this Palestinian woman. If you can't model that, you may as well go home. It was the hardest moment. She screamed at me for 15 minutes. After about 15 minutes of yelling at me, she looked up at me from the back of the room and she said, you're the first Jewish person who's ever listened to me. Can we meet for lunch? We did. We met several times, and I learned that Najwa had come to the United States because her ears had been impaired as a result of Israel's bombings at the time in southern Lebanon. Najwa was a nurse working in the PLO camps in southern Lebanon. She had come to the US for surgery on her ears. So we met 3 or 4 times and got to know each other, fell in love with each other, built a strong sisterhood. Najwa and I led one of the very early workshops for members of the Israeli Knesset and the PLO when it was illegal for them to meet. That would have never happened had I not in that moment found some resource in me to listen where it was unbearable to listen. And I believe the work of ending anti-Semitism is going to require Israelis, Jews, Palestinians, and all of our allies to be able to listen to both narratives where it is unbearable to listen. So take a big wiggle and a stretch. I got one more section. And this last section in my talk is, what can allies do? I'm not going to tell you all these things and leave you there. What can allies do? And I'm going to talk tachlis, which, as I was saying to Paul earlier, if you're going to be an ally to Jews, you got to learn to do chaz. So tachlis, which means details. Tachlis are what are on the ground details for being an ally to Jews. I am not going to talk about getting a city resolution passed. I am not going to talk about rallies in your neighborhood. Not because I don't think those are important. I was born an activist. I got trained by Saul Alinsky in the late 60s in activism. So I am a lifetime activist. But I believe that the core of activism is one-on-one relationship building. So I am going to offer you some what-to-dos that are about building relationships. So the first thing, and this is for Jews with Jews as well as for our allies with Jews. Ask Jews around you, what's it like in this period? When Donald Trump was elected, I cannot tell you the number of Jews calling me up saying, my suitcase is packed. I often say with Jews, because we were kicked out of country after country after country, Jews, it's never, are we going to have to leave? It's only when. It's like, has the cycle turned enough? If you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you have that image of Anna Tevka leaving the little village, the village like my grandmother left in Russia, because there had been a pogrom in that movie. So it's never, are we going to leave? It's only when. And this period for Jews, and again, I want to be clear, it's not just Jews. Many groups are devastated by what's happening. But again, I'm speaking about Jews and anti-Semitism in this moment. For Jews, banning books, attacking intellectuals, that was the first stages in Germany. First, they burned the books. Then they went after the intellectuals. Then they went after the Jews. So that circle is terrifying to my people. So as an ally, to just ask an open-ended question, what's it like for you in this period as a Jew? Second thing to do, when there are incidents, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, the hostage taking in Texas, don't go silent. Call your Jewish friends. I got your back. I'm with you. You are not in this alone. A little while back, when there were 2 mass shootings of Asian peoples by Asian men, I immediately got on the phone to every Asian person I love to say, I am so sorry. I am right here with you, to listen to them, to hold them in my arms, to say, I'm going to fight this with you. After the Tree of Life shooting, someone I care about a lot sent me a note. I don't remember a whole lot of the note. It was pretty, he tends to be very short of words. But what I do remember is he said in his note to me, Cherie, we are going to end this. I burst into tears. I printed that note out. I carried it with me for weeks and read it every day when I was so discouraged. That my friend said, and I believed him, that he was going to do everything he could to end this. My next point. Some of you may have noticed that my beloved Jewish brothers and sisters sometimes get a little panicked. The nature of Jewish history, of everything being okay until it's too late, has given us a lot of terror and panic. I always say we're always on guard and looking for what's not right. Anxious, anxious, worried, worried. There are many reasons I married my husband. He's quite an amazing person. But I am clear that one of the reasons I chose him, he was not triggered by my worry and terror. We've been together 36 years. He has never once yelled at me and said, stop being scared. When he worked at the Justice Department, he worked until 6 each day. And every once in a while, he would be in a late meeting and his phone was not on, so he couldn't call and tell me. And my whole attitude was 15 minutes he's late, I'll text and call. An hour he's late, I'm calling a best friend to strategize what to do. Longer than that, I'm calling the police. So George, whenever he would get out of his meeting and had his cell phone back on again, he would text me, honey, I'm on my way home. I'm not dead in the street. That was our statement to each other. He would say, honey, I'm not dead in the street. Never once did he ever come back and say, would you stop worrying? I'm okay. What's your problem? Stop being so anxious. Never once has he ever said that to me. He understood that the panic came from a history of anti-Semitism and that the best thing to do was to either just love me up or get me laughing. Which leads me to the next piece about what you can do around anti-Semitism. And you notice I am not focusing on anti-Semitic incidents, what you can do. I am focusing on what you can do with Jews, because that is the way we're going to eradicate anti-Semitism. So the next piece I want to say is, after genocide, we have some interesting difficulties that sometimes show. We sometimes get a little controlling. We sometimes try to take over. But when I do, I interrupt. I have to sit on myself in my organization when people are talking to not interrupt them. I don't mean to, I just get excited. One of the key things that you can do with Jews, and this is for Jews with Jews and allies with Jews, to interrupt anti-Semitism is to love us, not in spite of our difficulties, but with our difficulties. The example of loving Jews that are hard to love. I often will say at Jewish workshops, when we can love and bring them to the center of our circle, the schleppiest Jews, the most unappealing Jews, We will be doing Jewish liberation work. We will be ending anti-Semitism to welcome the schleppiest, most unappealing Jews into the center. And I will tell you a quick story. You may recall this a few years ago. Donald Sterling, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers. Donald Sterling was a raised poor Jewish guy from Brooklyn. He was having a private conversation with his girlfriend, and he said something racist. And I do not want to defend his racism or say that he is not accountable for it. Someone wanted to get him. They, took the tape, it went all over. He was kicked out of ownership of his team. Donald Sterling was banned for life from the NBA. A week later, I happened to be at a meeting of anti-racism activists. There are about 20 of us, national leaders on racism in the room. 17, and I hate all the terms. Well, BIPOC is probably the best one to use now. 17 of them were BIPOC people. 3 were white, and all 3 of the white people were Jews. That's often the case. Jews are often at the forefront of doing this kind of work. That night after the first day of our meetings, folks went out to dinner and I had something else to do, so I couldn't join them. So the next morning, we're starting our second day of meetings. People are schmoozing and connecting and just saying what they did the night before. The 2 other Jews said, we got together and decided to un-Jew Sterling, to un-Jew Sterling. I froze. And I'm sitting there saying, Cherie, are you going to say something in this room of anti-racism activists? And I heard myself yell at myself in my head, if you don't say something, you're going to hate yourself forever. So I thought, well, what do I say? And I looked at them and said, you know what? I'll claim him. Donald Sterling is still part of my people, defective as he is, racist as he was taped to be, he's still part of my people. The core of anti-Semitism is that Jews are expendable. Anytime we make a Jew expendable, we are perpetrating anti-Semitism, even if they do horrible things. And I just had 2 more points. Learn about Jewish cultures. We are not a monolithic people. There are Black Jews and Latinx Jews and Asian Jews and Native Indigenous Jews and Arab Jews. More than 50% of the Jews living in Israel are Arab Jews from surrounding Arab countries, from Morocco and Yemen and Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Iraq. Some Jews are religious. Some Jews are secular. Thinking of us mostly as a religion can be anti-Semitic because we are a people with a religion that some Jews practice. And my last point, and I don't know if this is in other train stations. I know in Union Station, NDC, there is a sign. See something, say something. On anti-Semitism, see something, say something. We need to speak up. And in my experience, both for Jews and allies, it's really hard to speak up about anti-Semitism. 2 years ago, I was leading these weekends all over the country for young adult Jews on anti-Semitism, internalized anti-Semitism, intersection of anti-Semitism and racism, Israel-Palestine. So I had a group in Philadelphia, and these were all young adult Jewish social justice activists. Some of them did work in the Jewish community. Some of them worked on other social justice issues. I asked them, how many of you in the last few months have ever taken on racism? You witnessed it, you saw it, you spoke out against it. Every single hand went up. Then I asked them, how many of you in the last few months have taken on anti-Semitism? You witnessed it, you saw it, you spoke up about it. Not one hand went up. And these are social justice, Jewish young activists, half of whom work in the Jewish world. In my experience, if you tell someone they're anti-Semitic, you tend to get the anti-Semitism thrown right back in your face. So to be an ally, the best thing you can do is to be a safe space for Jews to say, I just experienced anti-Semitism, and for you to say, thank you for telling me. I will stop there. I know we have some questions. And again, take a wiggle, get a drink, do what you need to do to take care of your bodies. I'll keep going with the questions until we need to stop. So I think Randy, I think some folks wrote in questions, other people. So Randy's going to give me a couple of the questions.
Sure. And thank you, Cherie, so much for that amazing presentation. I can't even tell you how many notes I took, but my desk is fully covered. I would love, so we did get some questions, and everyone is welcome to put questions into the Q&A. And let's see, I'm going to go first to this one. Could you say something about Zionism? What is it and why is it such a bad word?
Yes, the Zionism word. I think I was at the very first time that the statement Zionism is racism was ever put forward. When I was 19, a group of us at my campus at UCLA formed, we called it the Jewish Radical Community. And we were all excited about coming up with a radical understanding of being Jews. So we went to the Peace and Freedom Party convention in Chicago in 1968. It was right after the Six-Day War in Israel. As far as I know, that was the first time a resolution was passed. Zionism is racism. We walked out saying, we have to figure something out here. Because I could see then that it was going to rip progressives apart to not understand. I personally, this is me, Cherie, I don't use the word Zionist. I don't call myself a Zionist. I don't call myself a non-Zionist. I don't call myself an anti-Zionist. And I have friends who identify as all three, and friends I trust and respect. I personally don't use the term because it's so loaded. And if I were to say I'm a Zionist, Zionism was the liberation movement of Jews to want a homeland in Israel. That's what Zionism was. And I shared earlier how Jewish leaders were fighting about whether they, as a political strategy. It was a political strategy for trying to deal with the horrors of pogroms and genocide. I don't use the word because I think it's very confusing, but I support people that do. I think what's key is that without using the word, the idea that Jews deserve a homeland like all other peoples, so do the Palestinian people. Now, we got a lot of justice work to do there. That Jews deserve a homeland, and that is different than the state that exists. The Jewish state of Israel and its policies is not the same as saying Jews deserve a homeland. And where we will land and what it will look like that has justice and safety for Israeli Jews and Palestinians, people speculate, but I don't think we know yet. But the key thing for me is that we deserve a homeland. And I'll share one other thing about that. A bunch of years ago, a speaker was on a campus. And during his talk, he said, The only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. Jewish students stood up and said, I'm proud to be a Zionist. The Jewish student was slugged. It hit the 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock evening news. The president of the college was really distraught. We need to get some good publicity here. They brought in some mediator that I don't think did much. And then my organization, the National Coalition Building Institute, we were invited on campus to lead a program between Black and Jewish students on campus. I got to the campus, CBS and NBC and ABC crew were lined up. And I went up to them and said, I will let you come at the beginning to find out why the students came. Then I will invite you to come at the end of the program to interview the students that were there, but you can't be in the room recording during the workshop. I will say they did a very responsible story afterwards. One of the things we did, we call it Speak Out, where people get a chance to tell a story, a time they've experienced discrimination that was painful. And so we wanted to have the students be able to share stories of anti-Semitism and racism. So we brought up the Jewish student who had been hit that day when he said he was proud to be a Zionist. He said, my dad left Germany in the 30s. My whole childhood, he kept trying to tell me how scary it was to be a Jew in Germany. I didn't understand what he was talking about. I couldn't relate to my dad at all. Until that day, I heard that speaker say, the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. And I was terrified, and he burst into tears. He finishes his story, and we always ask the group afterwards what touched them, what came up for them hearing the story. The head of the Black African Heritage Center on campus that had invited the speaker put up his hand and looked at the Jewish student and said, I'm listening to your story and I feel like I could tell such a similar story. And he got up to tell his story on racism. We heard numerous stories about anti-Semitism and racism. And then it was time to do the NCBI process, the controversial issue process. And the issue the group chose as a controversy, and this is a controversy on campuses all over the country. Should speakers who say hateful things be welcomed on the campus? In other words, free speech versus hate speech. So we had a Jewish student and a Black African Heritage student speaking on each side. The Black African Heritage student goes first, and he says, don't tell us who we can listen to. Do you think we're stupid? Do you think we can't listen to someone and discern what is hateful and what is good in their message? Don't insult us. We are smarter than that. That's racist. Makes sense. The Jewish student goes next. Don't tell us to just trust you. Our whole history is one of being told everything's okay until it's too late. We need much more concrete things that will help us to trust. So after they did that, they were ready to do what we in NCBI call a reframed question. Their question was, how can Black students on campus have self-determination while at the same time the Jewish students on campus build trust? With that reframed question, we had moved so far from Zionism is racism and a Jewish student being slugged to, and they built a Black Jewish coalition on campus that lasted for years. They together as a coalition chose speakers that are controversial and invited them, went together, taught them the different messages. So that's, I know there was a lot to say about Zionism, but I hope that was helpful.
Very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you said that your husband was Roman Catholic. This is one of the questions.
A former Roman Catholic
A
priest.
former Roman Catholic priest. When you met him, how did you meet and how did each of your families react to your relationship?
Good, interesting question. how we met. There used to be, I don't think there internationally there are still, but there used to be national workshops on Christian-Jewish relations, conferences, meetings. And this one was in, I believe, 1983 in St. Louis. And as I mentioned earlier, my husband ran the Office of Ecumenical Affairs in Louisville, Kentucky, doing Catholic Jewish work. So he came to the conference. I signed up to lead a little workshop. And I was doing speak outs, like I mentioned in this previous workshop that I led. And I was working with a Jewish woman who was telling a story about anti-Semitism, and she burst into tears and started crying. George attended my workshop and realized that the emotional healing work I was doing was missing from his ecumenical dialogue work. So he signed up to come to NCBI, got trained, brought me to Louisville. I led a workshop for Catholics and Jews, and the rest is history. And I should say, I mentioned earlier that George got laicized, which means he is in complete good standing at the Catholic Church. Our wedding was a complete Jewish wedding with a rabbi. We did not have a priest, and our wedding is completely accepted by the Catholic Church. So I'll share one moment from each of our parents. Both of our parents are gone, so this is in blessed memory. His mother, the first time I met her, George was still a priest. He hadn't made the final decision to leave yet. And he took me to meet his family. I will never forget. His mother opens the door to greet me and she starts sobbing. And she's sobbing that her son, she was a devout Catholic woman, my mother-in-law, that her son might be leaving the priesthood. And she looks at me and said, honey, this has nothing to do with you. You are so welcome here. I'm so glad you're here. And then she's crying and crying. And I just thought that she could make that distinction. And my favorite moment with his mother was Slavic. And there's a Slavic custom at Christmas dinner. She would go around to each member of the family and take a dollop of honey and make a cross on the forehead. And she would get to me and she would take that dollop of honey and she would just plop it on my forehead. She wouldn't make a cross. And I just thought, I loved her for that she understood that it wouldn't be a good idea to make a cross on my forehead, but she also wanted to include me. So each time I would get a big dollop of honey on my forehead. His father, they had neighbors right next door that were Jewish. One time I was there at Christmas and Hanukkah happened to be at the same time. He went next door to get a recipe for latkes so he could make them so I would feel welcomed and that Hanukkah could get celebrated in their family. So that's a little about his family. My family adored George. My parents used to belong, it's called a chavurah. The Hebrew word actually means friends or comrade. Within their big synagogue, there were these clusters of couples and they were together for decades. And one of the members of that chavurah was named George. My mother loved to say, with such a big heart, I have two Georges, meaning the man George in her chavurah and my husband, her son-in-law, George. My father, this was at our wedding. My father did not speak up at all in groups. He was really shy. And we asked him to do one of the blessings. And I could tell he was super scared. And he got up, and I could tell he was shaking. And he looks at George and says, George, I'm so glad you're going to be my son-in-law. And then he says, and I'm so glad you married Cherie, because Cherie really, really, really needs you. And I was like, oh, Dad, that was so wonderful that he could say that. Just I thought it was hysterical. So there's much more. The last thing I'll say about me and George, when he and I met, his last name is Mazza, M-A-Z-Z-A. I said, George, and he told me that his family went from Spain to Italy in the 1400s. I said, George, "You're a Sephardic Jew." And he would laugh at me. Several years ago, he did research. The village his grandfather is from is called Sarasota. There is a rabbi, Rabbi Barbara, who's from Sarasota. Her husband is a Jew from Sarasota with the same name as George's grandparents. And she uncovered a synagogue. We went to visit it. We're honorary grandparents at a 13-year-old girl's bat mitzvah at this little synagogue in this little village in the south of Italy. The Catholic priest of the village takes his Catholic students every year to the synagogue saying, "You have to know this is your heritage." So the last piece I'll say is on this. When I first met George, we went to visit my relatives in Cleveland. And as I mentioned earlier, I was very close to my grandmother. George gets up to go to the bathroom. And my grandmother looks at me as only Jewish grandmothers could do and say, "Honey, is he Jewish?" I was not expecting that question. And I froze. And I just went, "Mm-hmm." And after George learned that he comes from Sephardic Jews, because I felt so bad that I'd lied to my grandma. And after George found out he comes from Sephardic Jews, I was like, "Grandma, I didn't lie to you after all." So that's a little about me and George.
Thank you, Cherie. So we've got just a few more minutes, actually. I would love to get your thoughts on this last one.
Okay.
You have mentioned a few things about Blacks and Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about the Black-Jewish alliance and building alliances?
Yes. Well, I'm going to start with a few things about myself because my first 15 years, I was in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. When I lived there, Cleveland Heights was a very Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. I actually just met I'm 73. I met someone this last weekend who's 88. And she said she's from Cleveland Heights and there were no Jews except her. So it used to be white Christian. Jews, they moved out, Jews moved in. Redlining started. Jews started moving out, Black families started moving in. My family sat down at the table. I was 10 years old. They described what was happening and they said, "We're not leaving." So Cleveland Heights, my neighborhood, there were 10 Orthodox schools at the corner, and there are a lot of Black African heritage families. And I got my synagogue to do work with a Black church when I was 10. I didn't understand. I felt that there was such a deep connection. So the few things I'll say is, one, everyone says Blacks and Jews were so connected in the civil rights movement. What happened? And this isn't to say that there weren't. Yes, Abraham Yeshua Heschel marched with Martin Luther King. Yes, Swerner and other Jews went to the South and some of them were killed. But Jews were also paternalistic. Blacks also kicked Jews out of organizations. So to romanticize the relationship makes it harder to do the bridging work that we need to do. So that's the first thing that I want to say. The other is just the way I talked about earlier, the pitting. Blacks and Jews were systematically pitted against each other. I will give you one example. 1979, Andy Young was the ambassador for the United States to the UN. Andy Young was a radical. Jimmy Carter was president. He no way wanted Andy Young to continue. However, there were some concerns of the Jewish leadership about Andy Young. Andy Young was forced to resign. The next day in papers all across the US, headlines were Blacks and Jews fighting it out. That week, and this was before cell phones, Jimmy Carter was on a boat going down a river unreachable by the press. It was easy and convenient. And I like a lot of things about Jimmy Carter. It was easy and convenient. The US administration did not have to own that they wanted to get rid of Andy Young. It was easy and safe to blame it on Jews. And it split things apart so deeply in that moment. I became a consultant to the National Affairs staff at the American Jewish Committee right after that. And I led workshops between Blacks and Jews on campuses all along the East Coast. But the understanding that that pitting of Blacks and Jews against each other is such a key piece. And I'll say 2 last points. I encourage us to get rid of the terms Black anti-Semitism and Jewish racism. Yes, Black Gentiles have anti-Semitism. Yes, white Jews have racism. We grew up in this society. How can we not? But often what happens is the crappy things Black people say is put out there. The 500 things the Christian right says is ignored. We had an incident in Washington, D.C. A city councilor a couple years ago said some yucky anti-Semitic things unawarely. Our mayor, Muriel Bowser, decided to do a citywide meeting. I was the keynote. And this person also went to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And the key thing for me was his anti-Semitism was all over the press. That same week was horrible right-wing anti-Semitism that was nowhere in the press. That's a key way we get systematically pitted against each other, is our racism or anti-Semitism gets put out for show and others things ignored. And the last thing I'll say is that 10-year-old girl that believed so passionately in Black Jewish alliance building. I feel deeply that we need unity of all peoples, but it's a particularly powerful alliance that I think can be certainly a core of a progressive movement.
I am honored to know you in all of your years now, and I can only imagine the conversation that we would have with a 10-year-old Cherie as well. Thank you so much. I would like to turn the microphone over to Paul. Paul, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Cherie. There's a lot
You're
to
so
think
welcome.
about. There's a lot to consider. And for the folks in the Finding Your Voice program, you'll have the opportunity to do some questions and answers, a more interactive platform in our May Finding the Voice program. For those of you who are not members or connected with the Doc C. Bracy Center for Human Reconciliation, I would advise you to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, so you can stay in touch with our talking series and other things that we're up to. Again, I thank you all for coming, and I thank Cherie for being here this evening. And everybody stay safe.